When you think of the word church, or if you hear it, what do you think? What do you visualize? If someone says, hey, I'm going to church, what is the picture that comes to your mind? And I want to answer that question this morning, kind of in an interesting way. I want us to take a architectural church history tour. Didn't see that coming. And about a week or two ago, I watched a sermon by one of my favorite pastors. He's in Portland, Oregon. His name is John Mark Comer. And I was absolutely blown away by his sermon. And so let me just be the first to say, so much of what I say this morning comes directly from him. He'll say it way better than I ever will be able to. So go Google him, go watch that sermon. I would encourage you to do that. But one of the things that he points out is that, you can learn a lot by how the church functions, by what the church is doing, what they're emphasizing, by looking at the church's architecture. And so I want us this morning, and we're gonna work our way backwards. So we're gonna do a little time traveling, and we're gonna start with where we are now, and we're gonna go all the way back to the early church. So I think for us today, in terms of modern contemporary culture, I think a lot of us think or imagine church in this way, and we'll show the first picture. So, this is the typical American evangelical megachurch. Okay? Now, most churches aren't this big. We're not this big. Most churches are not that big at all. But, and here's my point. Most churches today are built around the exact same thing going on here, and that is a stage. So right now at New Life, I'm here on a stage, and you are looking at me. Hopefully most of you, little secret, we can tell those of you who do sleep and doze off. Anyways, so you're looking at me right now at the stage. It's not even just during the sermon, right? So during announcements, during worship through music, all on the stage, the way that the chairs are arranged, this whole building is set up in such a way that this is the focal point. It's the exact same thing going on there. The interesting thing, and I don't even think we realize this, and this is fascinating to me, is that most church buildings are set up this way because they are influenced from decades ago of the entertainment theater culture that has developed in the modern Western world. So you could say, and this kind of sounds a little sacrilegious, but I think it does provide insight as to where the church is today. Many of our churches today are simply like religious theaters. Just an interesting thing to process. So John Mark, he continues on. And so right before this era that we're in, perhaps right before it, stemming from a couple hundred years ago, he calls the colonial architectural period. And we'll put the second picture up. So this is kind of your typical colonial church. I believe this picture is from New England. I lived in Boston for a year. This is the very typical type of church architecture there. And of course, it spread all throughout America, but especially New England. And the thing about this era is that all churches are essentially a square, perhaps maybe a rectangle, and of course, they have a steeple on them. But the rectangle, the square church here, of course, they had Sunday services. And then throughout the week, like many modern churches, there are contemporary community gatherings that take place in there. And so perhaps you look at this and you're kind of like, for the most part, that's actually really similar to today's church, except for one thing. The focus here, the emphasis here, isn't necessarily on the stage as much as it is on the pulpit. And that is a fine difference. And so, of course, if you know history, a lot of this owes its roots to the Protestant Reformation, where at that time the church really emphasized the pulpit, really emphasized preaching. And there's nothing wrong with that. I, for one, am actually a huge fan of that. But that that was a turning point in history. And so before this time period, for the vast majority of the church history, in what we would call the Middle Ages or the medieval time period, this is what most church architecture looked like. So this is what we call a cathedral. Now, cathedrals, not only are they quite beautiful, and I just learned this a week ago. Did you know that cathedrals, if you're looking at them from an airplane, from a bird's eye view, looking down on them, they're actually built in the shape of a cross? I didn't know that. But here's the thing. At this cross where they're not beams, but where the two beams meet, the focal point there is not the stage, it's not the pulpit, it's the altar. And so a cathedral during the Middle Ages, the whole point, the attention, where they wanted your eyes to go would be at the altar. And of course, this is where communion or the Eucharist, baptism, practices of that nature, that's where they happen. So just to give you a quick review, kind of where we're at so far, we started off with the church as a theater, essentially, where the focal point is the stage. Colonial period, there is a square rectangle church. The focal point is the pulpit. And in the Middle Ages, a cathedral, and the focal point is an altar. All of this leads us back to the very first couple hundred years of the church. And now we ask, okay, so what was the church architecture for the very first followers of Jesus? What was the building that they met in? Throw up the fourth and last picture. So, this is a very, very old picture. It's from an ancient Roman catacomb, sometime within the first couple hundred years after Jesus. And who here, it's hard to decipher at first, but who here can tell what's going on in this photo? Dinner. Yes. So, here's what we need to ask ourselves. What is the building, what is the architecture that they're meeting in? A house. Anita, you are 2 for 2 today. You are on fire. All right? You're on fire. And you're tired. That rhymes. You're on fire and tired. Anyways, okay. So, yes, this is a house. Now the question becomes this. What's the focal point? What's the main part that they are gathering around in this house? Yes, food on a table. So now you can really understand this picture. That is some people and they're around kind of like a U-shaped table. This, for the first couple hundred years of its existence, is the church. Isn't that interesting? The church, when it originally started, and here's my point this morning, it's really easy, met in a house around a table. That was church for them. They wouldn't have used the phrase like, a church service, because the word service implies, and we don't even realize this, but that implies that there's some type of, professional clergy who are in charge of organizing a service, making sure that it runs smoothly for all the people sitting down in the chairs in front. They didn't use the phrase, a church service. I think that is very convicting and insightful for the modern day American church. So the church met around a table. And so in the Greco-Roman world, they spoke Greek at that time period. The church became so known for this. It wasn't just like one church did this. I mean, this is by and large how all the churches operated. The Greeks call these love feasts. Maybe you've heard that before. They call them a love feast. Now, I wasn't alive during like Vietnam, where everyone's throwing up peace signs and all the guys have long hair and they wearing like those circle-colored glasses, the hippie movement. But this sounds like something from the hippie movement, a love feast. The word love in Greek is agape. So they would call these agape feasts. And the reason why, it's very obvious in the sense of the church met around a table and they would have a banquet. They would have a feast. We're talking tons and tons of food. And at the end of that, they would then celebrate communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. And so many scholars think that this practice originated from Jesus himself as he ate and drank all throughout his ministry. And that's what we're looking at in this series. And of course, Jesus at the end of his life, before he passed away and then was resurrected, he instituted what we call the Lord's Supper. And so most scholars think that the love feast was all of this coming together. And I'm not going to go too much more into this because next Sunday, that is exactly what we're looking at in terms of communion, the Lord's Supper, in some sense, eating and drinking with God. But I'll leave that alone for right now. And so it was just Tuesday or Wednesday last week, we actually rearranged a little bit of this series. So I think we had told you that we're going to spend the whole time in Luke. Sorry, sometimes pastors lie. So that was, well, it wasn't a lie at the time. It was honest truth. So we're going to take a little bit of a side route to that. And I'm going to take us outside of the book of Luke this morning. And we're going to hop around a little bit. And just to kind of give you a map of what we're doing, the last 2 weeks, here's what we did, if you weren't here. We looked at eating and drinking with others, particularly those who are lost, those who are not yet Christians. And if you look at the life of Jesus, that is really the majority of what he did. He was eating and drinking with tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners. Next week, as I mentioned, we're going to look at kind of the vertical dimension of this, eating and drinking with God through communion, the Lord's Supper. But for this Sunday, we're going to take kind of the horizontal view, meaning I want us to think about what does it mean, what does it look like, why should we eat and drink with other Christians, our brothers and sisters in Jesus? What does this ancient but very simple practice of eating and drinking with Christians, what does that look like? So this morning, church as a meal, just like the church architectural tour showed us. And that was a very nerdy thing to do, by the way. So maybe you're here and you're like, hey, this sounds very interesting, Mark, but where is this in the Bible? Where is this in Scripture? That's a great question. Every single Jesus follower should always ask that question. Where is this in the Bible? Where is this hippie movement, this casual, non-organized meal thing take place? Great question. Acts chapter 2, verse 42. If you don't have a Bible this morning, we always give these away. I'll be reading from page 759. These are in the chairs right in front of you. So Acts chapter 2, verse 42. This is a classic description of the early church, the very first followers of Jesus. Here's what their life looked like. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship. And then listen to this phrase, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And everyone was filled at awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and they had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. And then listen to this phrase again. They broke bread in their homes, and for the third time, and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now, there are so many things that we could say about this passage, and we actually preached on this passage in the series right before this. So this is a common passage to look at, and there's a number of things we could say. But here's what I want us to do this morning. I want us to just zero in on one aspect of this. Luke, who wrote this, he didn't have, an iPad. He didn't have an Amazon Kindle where he could just kind of highlight things very easily or underline or hit bold or italicize. So how did he If he wanted to emphasize something, what would he do? He would repeat it. This is a very known practice in the ancient world. So let me read for you 3 phrases that he says. The breaking of bread. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together. This isn't like a tricky thing to interpret. Most scholars all agree that what he is talking about here is exactly what it looks like. They're just eating together. And yes, it tells us that they spent time in the temple courts. And that matters, absolutely. Temple courts would be perhaps what a Sunday morning service is for us. Very similar. So yes, Sunday morning gatherings are important. Hear me loud and clear this morning. But they also very intentionally gathered in their homes around a table to eat together. And some people will say, well, the phrase breaking of bread here, he's really talking about communion. Again, most scholars agree, yes, communion was a part of this feast, this banquet, but the Lord's Supper did not happen until the very end of the banquet. And we know that from a number of things, pictures, other documents that we've read, things of that nature. This really was a banquet. So this is the most well-known verse depicting this. But I want to give us a couple more, just so you see that this is actually an assumption for the early church. Like, this is the norm. This wasn't like a holiday or something of that nature. I'll read you a couple others. Same book, Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, so Sunday, we came together to what? To break bread. And Paul spoke to the people. And because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. So according to this passage, what's the early church do? Sunday morning, they meet and they eat. It's kind of a fun little catchphrase there, meet and eat. And now what I really like about this passage is that it says Paul spoke till midnight. So I'm just saying, how Bible believing do you want to get? You know what I mean? So every time someone brings, that's not in the Bible, I'll say, okay, well, technically I should be preaching until midnight. So how Bible believing do you want to get? Anyways, just a little fun there. Here's another one, Jude, verse 12. We don't usually open up the book of Jude, it's just one chapter. But here's verse 12, and you'll never ever hear me say this again. But I don't want you to necessarily worry about the context of this passage. It's a very strange passage. But just notice a phrase there. Verse 12, these people are blemishes, and here it is, at your love feast, agape feast, eating with you without the slightest qualm, and on it goes. We don't need to read the rest. So maybe you're like, okay, I get what you're saying, Mark. I see a couple verses here. So you're saying the church meets around a table and is eating. They're having this feast, this banquet. Okay, sure. Maybe at this point, in your mind, you still have this picture, this is what I have a picture of just church life in general, of like, maybe they're meeting in this old fellowship hall, like stained carpet, gym, activity center, multi-purpose room, whatever it is, and it smells like stale sweat, and they're having a potluck, and all the casseroles are filled with mayonnaise or something like that. And everyone's just inside thinking, like, this tastes horrible, but nobody says anything. Okay, I grew up in some church potlucks, and that was my experience. I hear some laughs. That's not what's going on here. They're not meeting in a fellowship hall. Hopefully, they're not having casseroles with mayonnaise. Here's where they're meeting. I'm gonna give a couple more verses just to drive this home to you. Romans 16, 3 through 5. Paul, he just writes this in passing. I mean, this is just kind of like, what is the norm? Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. And here it is. Greet also the church that meets at their house. Remember church architecture? Where do we say Anita was on fire? She said house. This is what we're talking about here. Colossians 4:15. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. One more. Philemon 1 through 2. Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother. To Philemon, our dear friend and fellow worker. Also to Aphia, our sister, and Agrippus, our fellow soldier. Sorry if I mispronounced that. I'll see you one day in heaven. And here it is. And to the church that meets in your... I can't hear everyone. So did the church meet? In a fellowship hall, a worship center, a cathedral? No. They met in their house. What we call church a service. They called it a meal around a table. That is mind-blowing to me. So that means, there's no hip, cool worship band. There's no choir. There's no steeple. There's no organ. There's no crazy fancy website. Church, around a table with a meal. That's honestly all I have to say this morning. I don't have a funny story. I don't have this crazy metaphor. It's highly simple. It's not sophisticated. And so maybe you're thinking okay, is that really all you're saying, Mark? What am I supposed to do with that? Exactly what it sounds like. Eat and drink with your brothers and sisters in Jesus around a table. And eat and drink. But, there are always usually buts. Here's the thing. There are consequences when we don't do this. And I think the American church and our culture at large is reaping the consequences of this. Here's what I mean. Here's a quote from Leonard Sweet. He's written a great book on this topic. I encourage you to go read it. It's called From Table to Tablet. Very short, easy read. He writes this. An untabled faith is an unstable faith. And neglect of the table in our churches is echoed in our families and communities. I love that phrase. An untabled faith is an unstable faith. The neglect of the table in our churches is echoed in our families and our communities. So how is it echoed? Listen to these statistics. This is from an article in The Atlantic. It came out 4 years ago. It's titled The Importance of Eating Together. This isn't a church article. This is just The Atlantic, right? Many of us have heard of that publication. They say, sadly, Americans rarely eat together anymore. And listen to these statistics. The average American eats 1 in every 5 meals in their car. So 20% of us eat a meal in our car every 5 meals. Here's a second one. 1 in 4 Americans, so 25% of us, eat at least 1 fast food meal every single day. Now, who here is brave and honest to admit this is them? Anita. Okay, so here's the deal. I saw about 10 hands. This tells me 25%. So some of you are being honest. So I have a Del Taco $10 gift card for those who are willing to raise their hand now. I'm joking, I don't. Come on. Shame on all of you, but this is a safe place. We appreciate your transparency. Okay, let me stop there. We'll continue on. The majority of American families report eating a single meal together less than 5 days a week. And here's an interesting one. The average American family now spends nearly as much money on fast food as they do groceries. It gets worse. We're just getting going. Here we go. Listen to this. 17% of regular American families, I don't know what they mean by regular American families. Like, what does that mean? 17% of American families sit down for a meal. So, do the math. What is that, 83%? Yes. Okay, there we go. I passed high school math. 83% of American families do not sit down for a meal. Gets even worse. Half of that 17% are doing it while they watch TV. When they do eat together, it is only for 12 minutes that they are sitting down. This is astonishing. 60 years ago, they did the same measure. 60 years ago, the average American family sat down for an hour and a half, and now, 12 minutes. Think about that. Just 60 years. Hour and a half to 12 minutes. Here are the consequences, right? We talked about the echo in our families and communities. Here they are. This will change the way you parent. Same article from The Atlantic says this: students who do not regularly eat with their parents are significantly more likely to be truant at school. And if you don't know what the word truant means, we know what statistic you're in. See if you guys got that one there. Children who do not eat dinner with their parents at least twice a week are 40% more likely to be overweight compared to those who do. On the contrary, children who do eat dinner with their parents 5 or more days a week, and here's the list, have less trouble with drugs and alcohol, eat healthier, show better academic performance, and report being closer with their parents than children who eat dinner with their parents less often. Now, I also would add to this list, and this is just my opinion, I don't have statistics to back this up, but I would venture to guess that our lack of discipline, our lack of intentionality to sit down and to eat a meal together is a significant contributing factor to the loneliness in our world today. Isn't this interesting? We are as busy and as connected as ever before in the history of the world. Literally. Never in the history of the human race have we been as connected as we are now. So at our fingertips, most of us have an iPhone that has internet. Every store has Wi-Fi now, and if they don't, I don't go there, right? Oh, that irritates me. Anyways, you can check email wherever and whenever you want. You can go online. You can Google something. You can go on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. List goes on. We are as connected as ever before, but I think we are as lonely as ever before. Mother Teresa famously said, "Loneliness is the leprosy of the modern world." I think Jesus and the early church, they were on to something when they defined church as a meal around a table. Church as a meal. It's really that simple. Now, I think we have to be pretty intentional, pretty disciplined about this, because here's the deal. Our culture, and not necessarily on purpose, is just going to throw so many things at you to prevent this. Let me just list a couple. We already talked about one a lot. Fast food, right? Taco Bell. Like chalupas. Does Taco Bell still have chalupas? Okay. Some of you knew that really quick. I feel like Taco Bell changes their menu every 6 months, and they come up with these really creative things. Okay, anyways. So fast food is going to prevent you from sitting down and sharing a meal together. Those of you with kids or grandchildren, crazy extracurricular activities, right? Little League, dance, Boy Scouts, the list goes on. That's going to prevent you from sitting down and eating a meal together. The false illusion of electronic community will prevent you. Maybe you are sitting down, but you're not paying attention. Here's another one. TV. I mean, I'm guilty of this. There are so many times that Rachel and I have dinner. There's a baseball game on, basketball game on. It's okay, let's just have dinner in front of the TV. That's really a cheap substitute. And then it's interesting because, a lot of us, we don't want to miss a show. Like you're just dying to watch This Is Us or something. And so you eat dinner around the TV and it's like, well, hold on. Most of us have DVRs now. You can record it. Record it, watch it later, enjoy dinner. Who here is waiting for This Is Us to come back? Yes. Mandy, you're very excited. If you don't know what This Is Us, it's not a plug for it. It's a great show, though. Go watch it. Here's another thing. I found this eye-opening. John Mark points this out. Modern architecture actually works against us and prevents us from eating down and sharing a meal together. How? Think about houses now. Houses are built, new houses are built now for self-entertainment and to give you a sense of escape. What does he mean? Well, think about an old house. An old house, they have something called the front porch, right? Like, never seen that before. And what happens when you sit out on your front porch, in the morning, before or after sunset, whatever, you see your neighbor Joey mowing the lawn, you talk to him. Aunt Susie walks down the sidewalk with her dog, you talk to her. The mailman or woman comes in, drops off your package, you talk to him or her. I mean, front porches are a thing of the past. Front yards with grass are a thing of the past. And if you have grass, it might be fake grass now. All right, that's what I have. I don't have to ever lawn mow anymore. It's wonderful, I love it. But the coffee table, the dining room table used to be the center of gravity of the home. Here's what a quote I read says. The table is less and less the center of family life. We eat at the computer, standing in the kitchen, lounging on the sofa in front of the television, in the car, or walking along the street. We have shifted our houses from a front porch or a dining room-centric house to the backyard or to the back porch or lounging on the sofa or in front of the TV, whatever it is. And we are isolated and private and we're all about self-entertainment and we don't care about getting to know our neighbor. Just from the physical structure of our houses. One of my favorite things about our church in this area is that it is such a diverse area. 2 months ago, if you were here last Sunday, we had the Vicencios up on stage, and they shared about them hosting a 4th of July neighborhood party. And a couple months ago, when I asked the local outreach team, hey, I want us to actually do this before we ask the congregation to do it. Would any of you mind being the host, opening up your house? And immediately Ronald just said, oh yeah, we'll do it. There you are, Ronald. And what was interesting to me about that, I believe soon after he said, oh yeah, that's just what we do. That's just who we are. I mean, hospitality is kind of built into his blood. And what's interesting to me is they're Filipino. I know many other Filipinos who have that same posture of hospitality. Much of the Hispanic culture, many other cultures, hospitality is the assumption. I mean, that's just how they roll. For me, as a white American, man, that's not the way I grew up. And my parents were great, love my family. Right? But, close the garage door, gated communities. You just spend all your time inside. You don't go outside and interact with other people, invite them in. Because your home is your place of refuge. That's where you go to escape. I thought it was hilarious. John Mark Comer, he pointed this out. The Spanish catchphrase, mi casa es su casa, my house is your house. The English equivalent of that is a man's home is his castle. I'm not saying that to be funny. What a polar difference. My house is your house. Oh, and a man's home is his castle where it's locked up with a gate and you can't get in there. Which side would Jesus and the early church be on? I think it's pretty clear. So what does this mean practically? Eat and drink with your brothers and your sisters in Jesus. Seriously, here's the challenge. This week, grab a meal with someone, grab a drink with someone here who you're not best friends with. Let me also challenge our life groups. I think a lot of our life groups were great as, kind of like a study hall community. But how often do we meet around the table? People act and share very differently around a study than they do in sharing food. And maybe you're here and your life group already does a lot. Maybe you're here and that's just, you're like the Vicentios, and that's just built into your blood. You have people over, and I just want to say, awesome. Thank you so much. Keep on doing that. Keep on doing that. So Rachel and I, we've decided the last 6 months, a goal of ours has been to have someone over for dinner once a month. Now, to be honest, the last 3 months, that's been a challenge because now we have a 3-month-old child. But that's something that we want to get back on track with. And here's the thing, a couple pointers. As I alluded to, don't go out and eat with someone who's just like you. It's really easy for me to go, grab a meal with someone who loves baseball and basketball. It's really easy for me to go grab a cup of coffee with someone who loves good coffee. That's easy. I naturally gravitate towards that. Really, that's kind of actually me being selfish. Instead, I should be looking for people who, love fixing cars or knitting or country music. I'll take a sport jab, golf. I don't even like golf. Am I known to hang out, to eat and drink with people like that? Intentionally go eat and drink with someone here who's not just like you. A couple other dynamics to point out that John Mark mentioned. Families here this morning, invite a single person over. The church has done a horrible job prioritizing families and leaving singles behind. I remember being single in the church. Not only did I always get, asked obnoxious questions like, are you dating anyone, Mark? When are you going to get married? Why does that matter to you? I didn't say that, but that's what I thought. My sister, on the other hand, she'd let you know what she thought. And I see, good for her. People need to hear that. I love you, Becca. Here's the deal. Single people, they need to see what it's like to have a messy house, to have kids that are messy, to have marriages that are messy, and that's okay to say. Please, if you're married here and you have a perfect marriage, come let me know. Please let me know. Single people need to see the dynamics of what it's like to be married and kids, whether they end up getting married or not. Here's the other thing. I think anybody with kids will tell you this. I think of Ryan and Hartley. Little kids love single people. They can goof around and play with them. It works out great. Vice versa. Single people invite over a family. Invite yourself over. You know what I'm saying? To a family person's house. We laugh at that, but here's the deal. There are a lot of lonely and tired parents who are through the roof just trying to raise their kids, much less make dinner. They would love to have you over. Another demographic for people who are widowed. Here's another one that I think is so geared for new life. Young people, ask out an elderly person for breakfast or lunch. And here's the thing. They're not probably going to ask you. You're going to have to take the initiative to do that because honestly, they're probably scared to ask you. And that's okay. Learn from them. Soak up their wisdom. Little secret. They'll bless you. They'll probably pay for your meal. Moment of truth. If you're an elderly person here and one of our junior hires, high schoolers, college students in their 20s asked you out to go to breakfast or lunch, raise your hand if you would pay for it. Look. Oh, they want to take a picture of that. Keep your hand up. No, but seriously, look at that. If you want to date someone, ask them out that's a different sermon. Here's the thing. Eating and drinking is not just about eating and drinking. I want to be loud and clear this morning. I'm thinking of a verse such as in Hebrews. Spur one another on toward love and good deeds. That is why we meet together. So when you're eating and drinking with someone, invite the Holy Spirit in. Here are some things. Ask each other, how can I pray for you? What is God doing in your life? What are you struggling with? And you need to answer those questions too, not just asking them. Listen to them, love them, mourn with them, cry with them, laugh with them. Hold them accountable. Have them hold you accountable. Correct them. Allow them to correct you. Church is just a meal around the table. It's not a concert. Not just on Sunday mornings. One of my mentors has said this. It has stuck with me since. The modern day pulpit is the dining room table. The modern day pulpit is the dining room table. I think we can speak far more into people's lives and change lives and have our lives spoken into and changed around the dining room table than you will on a Sunday morning. In fact, I can probably guarantee you that. There is something holy about this time period. It's set apart for God, but the meal, the table is just as holy and geared for life transformation as the space we're in right now, if not more. And here's the thing, when we are intentional to eat and drink with one another, when you invite the Holy Spirit in, you are actually preparing and anticipating what we're going to do for eternity once Jesus comes back. The ancient prophet Isaiah foretold of a day when God comes back, when he comes back to restore and rescue and fix everything. And I long for that day. Here's how it's described in Isaiah chapter 25. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. And I love the food poetry here. And he will swallow up death forever. I'll drink to that. That's right, amen. We're going to celebrate that. That's right. I just thought of this question. Is there a drinking age in heaven? Okay, you guys said it. I didn't say that. That came from you, not the pulpit. Here, the whole symbolic point of Jesus eating and drinking with others was to provide a foretaste, an appetizer, a future picture of what's going to happen for eternity when he comes back. He says, let me give you a foretaste. Let me give you a sign of the future kingdom bursting into the present. Jesus' number one metaphor for the kingdom of God was a banquet with a table and open chairs for everyone who wants to come sit down. Let's anticipate that. Let me end with this quote. If I can invite the music team out now. Tim Chester, he says this: when your church family gathers together as a group of needy people and share food with Jesus at the center, with Jesus as the provider, you glimpse God's coming world right here, right now. The Christian community is the beginning and sign of God's coming world, and no more so than when we eat together. Our meals are a foretaste of the future messianic banquet. Our meals reveal the identity of Jesus. Our meals are a proclamation and a demonstration of God's good news. It's that simple. We've turned church on a Sunday morning into a theater when Jesus said it's a meal around a table. I mean, Jesus told us to remember him by eating and drinking. They did that after a huge banquet and feast. And they prayed with each other, they fellowshiped, they sang songs, they read scriptures. I mean, our vision of life groups, which is it's a house church. Life groups are a house church. You're no more less church than you are now. Is a vision of just eating around a table. And yes, it requires praying and fellowship and reading scriptures, absolutely. So that's an invitation for our church. So of course, one of the best ways to respond this morning is eating and drinking. Communion. The bread symbolizes Jesus' body sacrificed for you. The cup, his blood spilt for you. We have a prayer team. There'll be music. The ushers will come forward and take our offering. So I don't know where you're at. Maybe you should just open up your phone, write down someone's name. I need to get a meal with them this week, and I need to be intentional about it. Maybe you reach out to someone that honestly you don't want to hang out with. But let's practice this idea as church around a meal. Ushers, if you can come forward at this point.